Montana Territory, 1885. The winter sky hung low and heavy over the rolling hills, promising more snow before nightfall. Nathaniel Hayes stood on the ridge overlooking his property, Horizon Ranch, a Winchester rifle still warm in his gloved hands. At his feet lay the gray wolf that had been decimating his sheep, two lost just yesterday. The bitter wind cut through his coat, but Nathaniel barely noticed. His weathered face, framed by a beard that had grown too long these past months, remained impassive as he gazed down at the predator. In another life, he might have admired the creature's beauty, its fierce survival instinct, but ranching left little room for such sentimentality. Had to be done, he muttered to no one, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Slinging the rifle over his shoulder, Nathaniel turned toward home. The two-story ranch house stood solid against the wintry landscape, its stone foundation and sturdy timber frame a testament to the hands that had built it 6 years ago. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of warmth for miles around. Inside, the emptiness waited for him like an unwelcome guest that had long overstayed its welcome. 3 years of silence. 3 years of meals eaten alone. 3 years of talking to horses instead of a wife. In the parlor, Nathaniel removed his gloves and warmed his hands before the fire. His eyes drifted, as they always did, to the photograph on the mantel. Hannah, his late wife, smiled back at him, forever frozen in a moment of happiness he couldn't remember feeling himself. "The stagecoach comes today," he told her image, voice rough from disuse. "Don't worry, it's just an arrangement, not a replacement for you." His fingers found the wedding ring in his vest pocket. Hannah's ring, the one he'd removed from her cold finger but couldn't bring himself to bury with her. The gold felt heavy, weighted with memories and unspoken regrets. A voice, deep and aged with wisdom, seemed to float through the room like narration from another time. The winter of 1885 in Montana wasn't just cold outside. There were hearts frozen harder than the ice on the Yellowstone River. Nathaniel checked his pocket watch. Nearly noon. The stagecoach would arrive soon, bringing with it the woman who had answered his advertisement for a mail-order bride. The arrangement had seemed practical when he'd posted it 3 months ago. A woman needed security. He needed something. Companionship without the vulnerability of courtship. A transaction both could understand. He hadn't asked for much in his letter, just someone practical, capable of handling a household, someone who wouldn't mind the isolation of ranch life. He'd been honest about being a widower, about the remoteness of the place. What he hadn't mentioned was the emptiness that had taken residence in his chest, or how sometimes he'd go days barely speaking a word to another human soul. In his bedroom, Nathaniel changed his shirt and attempted to tame his hair before the small mirror. The face that stared back at him looked older than his 42 years, lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much suffering. First in the war, then with Hannah's passing. A flash of memory, younger Nathaniel, a faint scar from battle on his cheek, and Hannah touching it without fear, her fingers gentle against his skin. "I don't judge people by their scars, Nate," she'd whispered. "I never have." The sound of approaching hooves and creaking wheels pulled him back to the present. Nathaniel straightened his collar, tucked Hannah's ring deeper into his pocket, and headed outside to meet the stagecoach. It pulled up in a spray of icy mud, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The driver, a grizzled man named Jenkins who ran the route between Wolf Creek and the outlying ranches, grinned down at him with barely concealed mockery. "Your package, Hayes," he called, gesturing to the coach with his whip. The door opened, and a woman stepped down carefully. She was dressed in black, her face hidden behind a heavy veil attached to a modest hat. Something about the way she moved, cautious, deliberate, suggested she was accustomed to being watched, to calculating each step. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremble in her gloved hands. "I'm Abigail Morgan." She lifted her veil, and Nathaniel felt his breath catch. The right side of her face was a landscape of burn scars, puckered tissue running from temple to jaw, pulling her mouth into a slight asymmetry. Her right eye was narrowed by the surrounding scar tissue. The left side, however, remained untouched, almost beautiful in its contrast. High cheekbones, smooth skin, clear blue eye. Nathaniel stood frozen, every polite greeting he'd rehearsed vanishing from his mind. Abigail interpreted his silence with the weary wisdom of someone long accustomed to such reactions. Her posture stiffened defensively, a subtle armor she'd developed over the years. The agency neglected to mention my condition, she said, voice carefully measured. I understand if you wish to nullify our agreement. The eastbound stage will arrive tomorrow. In the silence that followed, Nathaniel heard Hannah's voice in his memory, clear as church bells. Don't judge people by their scars, Nate. I never did that to you. He found his voice at last. The agreement stands. It came out rougher than intended. Welcome to Horizon Ranch, Miss Morgan. Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but a slight easing of tension. She nodded once, her expression carefully neutral. Jenkins dropped her small trunk to the ground with little ceremony. Good luck, Hayes, he said with a smirk. You'll need it. With a flick of the reins, the stagecoach pulled away, leaving Nathaniel and Abigail standing in the yard, strangers bound by a contract neither fully understood. Nathaniel carried her trunk inside, noting how light it was. Everything she owned in the world, contained in one small box. It made him acutely aware of the power imbalance between them. He with his land, his home, his security, and she with nothing but a hope for shelter. Abigail moved through the house with quiet efficiency, her eyes cataloging everything. Torn curtains, dust on every surface, kitchen with sparse bachelor provisions, floors unswept for weeks. Without asking permission, she removed her coat and hat, set down her small bag, and began working. Nathaniel stood uncertainly in the kitchen doorway, watching as she found an apron hanging on a peg and tied it around her waist. You don't have to start right away, he began. Where do you keep the cleaning rags? She asked without looking at him, already filling a basin with water from the pump. Under the sink, but she had already found them and was wiping down the kitchen table, her movements precise and practiced. A woman who had worked hard for a long time. Nathaniel cleared his throat. I'll show you the bedrooms. You should I'll take the maid's room, Abigail said, nodding toward the small room off the kitchen. That one. That's not, you should have the proper bedroom. She finally looked at him directly, the scarred side of her face catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. Mr. Hayes, let's be clear about the terms. I'm here to work, keep house, cook, mend. Nothing more is expected or offered. The small room is sufficient. Her words formed a carefully built wall between them. Nathaniel wanted to argue but couldn't find the right words. She had already turned back to her cleaning, dismissing him without rudeness. Just clear boundaries. He retreated to the barn, where at least the horses didn't make him feel like an intruder in his own home. Dinner that first night was a simple affair, salt pork and beans that Abigail had somehow transformed from his meager pantry supplies. They sat across the table from each other, the scrape of cutlery against plates loud in the silence. How long have you been alone here? Abigail asked, breaking 5 minutes of quiet. 3 years, since my wife passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. He wanted to say more but found himself unable to elaborate. 3 years and he still couldn't speak of Hannah without his throat closing up. They finished eating in silence. Afterward, Abigail washed the dishes with methodical precision while Nathaniel escaped to the porch, where he lit his pipe and stared out at the darkening landscape. When he returned inside an hour later, her door was closed, a thin line of lamplight showing beneath it. Nathaniel paused outside for a moment, struck by the strangeness of having another person in his home again. A stranger with secrets etched into her skin as surely as his own were carved into his heart. That first night, Abigail woke to a sound that pierced through her shallow sleep. A cry, raw and anguished, followed by a heavy thud. She sat up, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. Before a second cry sent her hurrying from her bed, she found Nathaniel in his room, thrashing in the grip of a nightmare, sheets tangled around him, sweat gleaming on his forehead in the moonlight that filtered through the window. He called out names. Hannah, and another she didn't recognize. Thomas. No, not my fault. Not my. Hesitating only briefly, Abigail approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Hayes, she said firmly. Mr. Hayes, wake up. He came awake with a violent start, eyes wild with fear, one hand instinctively clutching his left arm. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her, his gaze haunted by whatever horrors his dreams had conjured. You're all right, Abigail said, her voice soft but steady. It was just a dream. Slowly, awareness returned to his eyes. Miss Morgan, he said hoarsely, I apologize for disturbing you. "Are you all right, Mr. Hayes?" "Just old nightmares." He sat up, and in the silver wash of moonlight, Abigail saw what his long-sleeved shirts had concealed. His left arm ended just below the elbow, the sleeve of his nightshirt pinned up. Nathaniel followed her gaze, and something hardened in his expression. "The war," he said shortly. "Some souvenirs you can't leave behind." "War leaves many kinds of scars," she replied, neither pitying nor retreating. "Would you like some water?" He seemed surprised by her matter-of-fact response. "Please." When she returned with a glass, he had composed himself, sleeve adjusted to cover his arm. He drank deeply, then set the glass aside. "It's been happening less frequently," he offered, an explanation that felt like an apology. "The war doesn't ever really end for some," Abigail said, echoing words she had heard many times in the years after the conflict. "Not inside." Their eyes met in the darkness, a moment of understanding passing between them. Two people marked by different tragedies, recognizing the familiar shape of pain in each other. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the water and the kindness." Abigail nodded and withdrew, closing his door softly behind her. In the barn the next morning, morning, Thaddeus Cooper, the 75-year-old ranch manager who had worked the land since before Nathaniel acquired it, observed his employer with shrewd eyes. "You're up early," the old man noted, watching as Nathaniel saddled his horse with more care than usual. "Work doesn't wait," Nathaniel replied, tightening the cinch. Thaddeus leaned on his walking stick, his weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "She arrived yesterday, then? Your mail-order bride?" "She did." "And?" Nathaniel paused, one hand on the saddle. "She's not what I expected." "People rarely are," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of observation. "That's what makes life interesting." Later that day, as Thaddeus returned to the small cabin he shared with his wife Ruth at the edge of the property, he reported the development. "She's here, the bride Hayes sent for." Ruth, 70 but still straight-backed and sharp-eyed, looked up from her mending. "What's she like?" "Haven't met her yet, but Hayes was different this morning," he smiled. "Smiled?" Ruth set down her sewing. "First time since Hannah passed." "Maybe." Thaddeus settled into his chair by the fire, stretching his arthritic legs toward the warmth. "A scarred man and a mail-order bride. The Lord works in mysterious ways." "She's probably desperate, poor thing. No family, no prospects. These arrangements are never about love." "Maybe not at first," Thaddeus conceded, his eyes drifting to the daguerreotype on their mantel, taken on their 50th anniversary. "But love has a way of growing in the unlikeliest soil, if given half a chance." Ruth smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Like that stubborn patch of wildflowers you can never quite plow under?" "Exactly like that." He reached for her hand, his rough palm against her equally weathered one. "They both need so much more than either would ever ask for." During those first days, Abigail established her place in the household with quiet determination. She rose before dawn, had coffee brewing when Nathaniel came downstairs, and kept herself busy from sunrise to sunset, cleaning, cooking, mending clothes that had gone too long without attention. They developed a routine of careful politeness, speaking when necessary, their interactions brief and focused on practicalities. Nathaniel would mention when he'd be late for dinner. Abigail would inform him if supplies were running low. They existed in parallel, sharing space but seldom truly engaging. Yet small changes began to appear. Abigail found old curtains in the attic and repurposed them, brightening windows that had been draped in faded, torn fabric. She discovered Hannah's neglected herb garden behind the kitchen and spent hours clearing weeds, preparing it for spring planting. She organized the pantry, making the most of limited provisions. Nathaniel noticed these changes but said little, uncertain how to express gratitude without crossing the careful boundaries Abigail had established. Instead, he began leaving small offerings: a bundle of kindling already prepared beside the stove in the morning, a stack of books from his modest library placed on the kitchen table with a note, "If you enjoy reading." It was in her second week at Horizon Ranch that Abigail accompanied Nathaniel to Wolf Creek for supplies. The journey was largely silent, the wagon jolting over frozen ruts in the road, mountains looming in the distance beneath a steel-gray sky. Abigail wore her veil again, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. As the small town came into view, a main street lined with false front buildings, a church steeple, the Saturday market bustling with activity, she grew noticeably tenser. "They're not unkind people," Nathaniel said, surprising both of them by breaking the silence. "Just curious about newcomers." Abigail nodded without responding, her back straight as a fence post. They hitched the wagon outside the general store. As they walked past, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Whispers started like wind through dry grass. Nathaniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same discomfort he'd experienced when he'd first returned from the war, his missing arm drawing stares and murmured comments. Mrs. Prescott, the preacher's wife, intercepted them at the store entrance. Her smile was bright, loud, performatively kind. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted, her gaze immediately shifting to Abigail. "And this must be your arrangement." She looked at Abigail with exaggerated compassion, her head tilting to one side. "Bless you, dear girl, and bless you, Mr. Hayes, for your Christian charity in taking in the unfortunate." Abigail's jaw tightened, her hands fisting in her skirt beneath her coat. Nathaniel felt heat rising in his collar, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "We need supplies, Mrs. Prescott," he said flatly. Of course, I'll pray for you both." She sailed past, satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a stove. Inside, Abigail selected flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities with quiet efficiency. The shopkeeper's wife stared openly. Two young women whispered behind the fabric bolts, giggling behind their hands. Nathaniel found himself hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment. He'd grown accustomed to the occasional looks his own disability drew, but the reaction to Abigail seemed crueler somehow, more intrusive. Outside, as they loaded supplies into the wagon, Victor Blackwood blocked their path. Tall, well-dressed, with cold eyes, he owned the neighboring Blackwood Ranch and thought that made him king of the territory. He'd also once courted Hannah before she chose Nathaniel instead, a rejection he had never quite forgiven. "Heard you bought mail order, Hayes," Blackwood said, his grin sharp as a knife. "Didn't know they were running a charity service now." Nathaniel's hands stilled on the feed sack he was lifting. Beside him, Abigail stood motionless, her expression hidden behind her veil. Blackwood tipped his hat to her with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, brave of you to show your face in public, so to speak." Abigail didn't respond. Instead, she picked up a sack of flour and carried it to the wagon herself, her movements deliberate and dignified. "What did that arrangement cost you, Hayes?" Blackwood continued. "Or did they pay you to take her off their hands?" Nathaniel's fists clenched, words tangled in his throat, caught between propriety and rage, between what was proper and what was right. He said nothing, paralyzed by the same hesitation that had haunted him for years. Before he could respond, Abigail's voice came from behind her veil, clear and cold as ice. "I'd rather be a charity case than a man with a heart as scarred as your soul, Mr. Blackwood." The street went silent. Blackwood's smile faltered, then hardened into a sneer. "You've found yourself a spirited one, Hayes. Good luck taming her." He stalked away, leaving Nathaniel staring at Abigail with new eyes. Women rarely spoke back to Blackwood, who held too much influence in the small community. The ride home stretched longer than the ride in, miles of silence between them. Nathaniel's knuckles were white on the reins, shame and anger warring within him. Finally, as the ranch came into view, he spoke. "I should have said something to Blackwood. I'm sorry." Abigail looked at him, really looked, perhaps for the first time since her arrival. "You don't owe me defense, Mr. Hayes." "Maybe I owe myself one," he replied quietly. Something shifted in her eyes, not hope exactly, but a crack in her armor. She turned away, but not before Nathaniel caught the slight upward curve of her lips, the first hint of a smile he'd seen from her. That evening, Nathaniel sat at his kitchen table, the marriage license before him, unsigned. It was just paper, a technicality. He could send her back with no legal obligation. Signed, it was a promise. He thought of Blackwood's sneer, Mrs. Prescott's loud pity, the way Abigail had carried that flour sack herself while he stood frozen. He thought of Hannah, what she would say if she could see him now. "Be better than your fear, Nate." With a steady hand, he signed his name, the ink dark against the cream paper. Abigail emerged from her room wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She stared at the license, at his signature, bold and black. Why now? Her voice was barely audible. Because I made a promise, he said simply. I keep my promises. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. She signed her name beside his. Abigail Morgan Hayes. The contract became covenant. Neither knew exactly what kind. March arrived with mud and melting snow, 6 weeks since Abigail had stepped off that stagecoach, and the house had transformed. New curtains sewn from fabric she'd found in the attic brightened the windows. Floors gleamed. The kitchen smelled of bread and coffee instead of dust and neglect. Nathaniel found himself listening for her movements, the swish of her skirts, the soft humming she did while kneading bread, small sounds that made the house feel alive again. He'd begun to notice things about her, how she always had a cup of tea waiting when he came in from the cold, how she never complained about the endless work, how she sometimes paused by the window in late afternoon, face turned to the weakening sunlight as if storing its warmth. One morning he came in from checking fences to find his torn winter coat laid across the table. Mended. The stitches were tiny, perfect, stronger than the original seam. My mother used to stitch like this, he said, running his fingers over the repair. Abigail looked up from the stove. Mine too. A small shared memory. It wasn't much, but it counted. In the evenings they still maintained their distance, but the silence between them had softened from awkward to comfortable. Sometimes Nathaniel would read by the fire while Abigail mended or knitted. Occasionally they spoke of practical matters, which fields to plant first, whether the roof would need repairs before next winter. They didn't discuss the past. Nathaniel never asked about her scars, and Abigail never inquired about his arm or the nightmares that still occasionally woke him. Their wounds were visible enough without words to probe them. Late March brought an unexpected blizzard. Nathaniel barely made it to the barn in time, secured the horses and livestock, then fought his way back to the house through whiteout conditions. They were trapped inside for 3 days, the world beyond the windows a swirling white void. The first day, they were careful, polite. Abigail cooked. Nathaniel brought in firewood. They spoke only about necessities, how long the storm might last, whether they had enough provisions, if the roof would hold under the weight of the snow. On the second day, proximity softened edges. Confined to the house with nowhere to retreat, they found themselves drawn to the fire in the parlor, the warmest place in the house. Nathaniel discovered an old checkerboard in a cabinet and set it up on the small table between them. Do you play? He asked. I used to. It's been many years. He taught her again, patiently explaining moves she'd forgotten. She was terrible at it, apologetically so. When she inadvertently made a move that trapped 3 of his pieces, her look of surprise was so genuine that Nathaniel found himself laughing. A rusty sound, but real. You're letting me win, she accused, smiling for the first time without trying to hide her scarred side. I'm trying, he protested. You're just that bad. She threw a wooden checker at him playfully. He caught it, grinning, and for a moment they were just a man and woman enjoying each other's company, their past temporarily forgotten. The third day she found a book of poetry among Hannah's things and read aloud by the fire, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of the verses. Nathaniel half listened, mostly watched her, the way she tucked hair behind her ear, the way she got lost in the words, forgot to be guarded. That evening, exhausted by the day's unusual sociability, she fell asleep in the chair by the fire, the book open in her lap. Nathaniel stood over her, heart pounding with uncertainty. In sleep, her face was peaceful, the scars just landscape, not barrier. She looked younger, vulnerable. He shouldn't touch her. They had boundaries. Careful distance. He lifted her anyway. She was lighter than expected. Carried her to her room, laid her gently on the narrow bed. She murmured something, turned into the pillow, didn't wake. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, hands shaking slightly. Something was changing between them. Something he wasn't ready to name. Morning. Abigail woke in her bed, confused. The last thing she remembered was reading by the fire. Her book sat on the nightstand. He'd carried her, touched her, been gentle. She pressed her palm where his hands would have been, felt the hard hammering of her heart. In the kitchen, Nathaniel poured coffee with unsteady hands. The ground had shifted beneath them both. There was no going back now. On the 4th night of the blizzard, Abigail woke screaming from her own nightmare, a rarity for her usually controlled sleep. Nathaniel found her sitting bolt upright in bed, trembling violently, eyes wide with remembered terror. "Fire," she gasped when she saw him. "It's always fire." He sat on the edge of her bed, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to offer comfort. "You're safe," he said quietly. "There's no fire here." Slowly, her breathing calmed. Nathaniel handed her a glass of water he'd brought, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "My scars," Abigail said finally, her voice steadier. "They're not the worst thing the fire left me with." Nathaniel nodded, understanding completely. "I know. The worst scars are the ones no one else can see." She looked at him with new surprise. "You have them too?" "Everyone does," he said simply. "Him deeper than others." They sat in companionable silence, sharing space and breath, both understanding that some wounds needed air more than bandages. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was recognition, seeing and being seen. At his cabin, Thaddeus observed the ranch house through his window, lamplight still burning despite the late hour. "They're both up," he noted to Ruth, who was preparing for bed. "Probably the storm making them restless," she replied, brushing her silver hair. Thaddeus shook his head. "Something's changing. I saw him smile yesterday when she wasn't looking, and she watched him walk to the barn this morning like she would memorizing his steps. You're an old romantic, Thaddeus Cooper, and you love that about me." He turned from the window. "They need each other, those two. More than either will admit." "Love takes time," Ruth said gently, "especially when you're carrying as much hurt as those two are." "And sometimes," Thaddeus countered, "love is the only thing strong enough to heal that kind of hurt." April exploded in green across Montana. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows. Birds returned, filling dawn with song. The world was rebuilding itself after winter's dormancy, a reflection of the slow renewal happening within the walls of Horizon Ranch. Nathaniel and Abigail planted the garden together one bright morning. They worked side by side in the warm soil, the scent of earth rich around them. Nathaniel showed her how deep to plant tomatoes. Abigail taught him seed spacing from memories of her mother's garden lessons. Their hands moved in rhythm: dig, plant, cover, water. Abigail hummed while working, unconscious and natural, a tune Nathaniel didn't recognize. He found himself pausing, leaning on his shovel, just listening. She noticed, stopped humming. "I'm sorry, Don't be," he interrupted, his voice rough with feeling. "Please don't be." Their eyes met, held. Abigail looked away first, cheeks flushed, but the humming resumed shortly after. A little softer, but present nonetheless. That Saturday, Nathaniel rode to town alone. He returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. Setting it on the kitchen table where Abigail was kneading bread, he shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. "For you," he said simply. Abigail wiped flour from her hands and untied the string with careful fingers. The paper fell away to reveal blue calico fabric, soft, new, beautiful. Her eyes filled, and she touched it as if it might disappear. "Nathaniel, I can't." "It's not charity," he said quickly. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and it affected him more than he cared to admit. "Just, you deserve pretty things." She hadn't owned anything new in 80 years, had forgotten what it felt like to be given something just because. "Thank you," she whispered, heartfelt and genuine. That night she stayed up late, cutting pattern pieces by lamplight. Nathaniel pretended to read, mostly watched her work. The house felt warm, full in a way it hadn't in years. The weather continued to improve, bringing with it longer days and easier work. Nathaniel found reasons to be around the house more: a fence that needed mending nearby, a horseshoe to be fixed in the yard workshop, tools to be sharpened on the porch. One evening they sat on that porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. Abigail sewed, working on the dress from the blue calico. Nathaniel whittled a piece of pine, the shavings collecting at his feet. Comfortable silence enveloped them. Without warning, Abigail leaned against his shoulder. Testing. Tentative. Nathaniel went absolutely still, barely breathing. She didn't move away. His heart thundered in his chest, a stampede of feelings he'd thought long dormant. He turned slowly, carefully. His right hand rose toward her face, the scarred side. His thumb traced her jaw, feather light, barely touching. Abigail's breath caught, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes searched his, dark and hopeful and frightened all at once. He leaned closer, just a heartbeat away, just a breath, and then Hannah's ghost rose between them, a memory as tangible as a physical presence. What if you fail her like you failed me? Nathaniel hesitated, just for an instant, just long enough. Abigail felt it like ice water, the momentary doubt, the fear. She pulled back, stood abruptly. It's late. Good night, Nathaniel. It was the first time she'd used his name, and it sounded like a goodbye. She disappeared inside, and moments later, Nathaniel heard her door close. Lock, click. He sat on the porch until midnight, head in his hands, hating himself for his cowardice. Inside, Abigail pressed her face into her pillow to muffle sobs. The moment had been perfect, terrifying, real, and they'd both let fear win. The blue fabric lay untouched on her table, a reminder of hope briefly kindled and then extinguished. The next morning, distance returned. They were polite, careful with each other, breaking apart quietly like ice in spring thaw, splintering along invisible fault lines. Abigail busied herself with cleaning already spotless rooms. Nathaniel found urgent work in the farthest pastures. The wall between them had been rebuilt, higher and stronger than before. When as Nathaniel rode out that morning, he passed Thaddeus mending a section of fence. "Something happened between you two?" the old man asked without preamble. "Nothing worth mentioning," Nathaniel replied, not slowing his horse. "Nothing, eh?" Thaddeus called after him. "Then why are you running like a man being chased by his own shadow?" Nathaniel didn't answer, just urged his horse faster, as if he could outride the truth in the old man's words. That evening, alone in her room, Abigail took out the letters she'd written, letters never sent, addressed to a father who had disowned her. She read them by lamplight, each one a testament to years of rejection and survival. One fell to the floor, its contents stark in their anger. "To Judge Morgan, Chicago, your daughter still lives. I hope you feel the guilt of abandoning her." She gathered them up, these pieces of her past, and considered burning them in the small stove. Instead, she tucked them away again, unable to destroy even painful memories. Unknown to her, a single envelope remained on the floor, half hidden beneath the bed, waiting to be discovered. Late April brought a stillness to Horizon Ranch, a quiet tension that hung between its occupants like morning mist over the valley. Nathaniel and Abigail moved through their days in careful orbits, never colliding but always aware of each other's presence. The almost kiss on the porch had changed something fundamental between them. Acknowledging feelings neither was prepared to face. Abigail threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, as if physical exhaustion might quiet her troubled mind. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, reorganized shelves that needed no attention, and spent long hours in the garden, coaxing seedlings from the warming soil. The blue calico remained untouched on her sewing table, a silent reminder of possibilities left unexplored. Nathaniel found reasons to be away from the house, mending distant fence lines, checking on far-off cattle, riding into Wolf Creek for supplies they didn't truly need. He told himself he was giving Abigail space, but in truth he was running from his own feelings, from the vulnerability that terrified him more than any physical danger ever had. One cool morning, as mist clung to the grass and silver beads, Abigail was cleaning the attic when she discovered a wooden chest tucked beneath the eaves. The brass lock had long since broken, leaving the contents accessible to anyone who dared look. Something about its forgotten placement, pushed into shadows, suggested secrets deliberately hidden. Inside, she found Hannah's personal effects, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles, a collection of ribbons, a small bottle of perfume now faded. Beneath these lay a leather journal and a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Abigail knew she should close the chest, respect the privacy of the dead, but her fingers lingered on the journal, and before she could reconsider, she had opened it to the middle pages. February 15th, 1882. The darkness comes again. I smile when Nathaniel is present, but when alone, I can barely rise from bed. Another month, another disappointment. No child quickens in my womb. The doctor says there's nothing wrong with either of us, just God's will. What cruel will denies a woman her purpose? What loving God would leave me so hollow? Abigail's breath caught. She turned pages, reading entries that painted a picture so different from the saintly woman Nathaniel seemed to worship in memory. April 3rd, 1882. I suggested returning east to be near my family. Nathaniel refuses. He says this is our home, our land. He doesn't understand that walls and acres mean nothing when your soul is starving. I see the way the women in town look at me with pity, the barren wife, the failed woman. Nathaniel sees nothing. He works and works, as if enough sweat might produce the child I cannot give him. The entries grew darker as months passed, Hannah's handwriting becoming more erratic, the words sometimes blurring as if tears had fallen upon them. December 12th, 1882. I cannot endure another Christmas watching other women's children sing carols in church. I cannot bear another pitying glance, another well-meaning question about when we will be blessed. The laudanum helps me sleep, but waking is torture. Nathaniel tries to comfort me, but his hope is like a knife in my heart. Hope is a cruel visitor in a barren house. The final entry, dated February 20th, 1883, sent a chill through Abigail's body. I can no longer continue as this empty shell. Forgive me for not being strong enough. Find someone who can love you completely, as I once did before the emptiness consumed me. Below these words was what appeared to be a farewell letter, carefully composed unlike the chaotic journal entries above it. My dearest Nathaniel, by the time you find this, I will have found peace. Please know that this is not your failing, but mine. A woman should be able to give life, and I have failed in this most fundamental purpose. The darkness has become too great, the emptiness too vast. Do not blame yourself. You have been patient beyond measure. But I cannot bear to see the hope die in your eyes month after month, year after year. I cannot bear to disappoint you again. When enough time has passed, find happiness again. You deserve a whole woman, not this broken shell I have become. Forgive me, Hannah. Abigail closed the journal, hands trembling. Hannah had not died of illness as Nathaniel had claimed. She had taken her own life, leaving him drowning in guilt and unanswered questions. The perfect, saintly wife he mourned was, in reality, a deeply troubled woman who had suffered in silence until she could bear it no longer. With great care, Abigail returned the journal and letters to the chest, closing it gently as if it contained fragile glass rather than painful memories. She sat back on her heels, heart aching not just for Hannah's suffering, but for the burden Nathaniel carried. The secret of his wife's suicide, the shame he must feel at being unable to save her from her own despair. She understood now why he hesitated that night on the porch, why he kept Hannah's ghost between them. It wasn't just the fear of loving again, it was the fear of failing again, of watching another woman he cared for suffer while he stood helpless. As she descended the attic stairs, Abigail felt a weight settle upon her shoulders, the knowledge of a pain she wasn't meant to discover, a secret that explained so much about the guarded man who had married her. That evening, Nathaniel returned late, his expression distant as he washed up for dinner. Abigail served the meal in silence, watching him with new understanding. The burden he carried was far heavier than she had imagined. The garden's coming along well, she offered, attempting to bridge the silence. Good, he replied, distracted. The south pasture fence is repaired, should hold through summer. More silence. Abigail gathered her courage. I found some of Hannah's things today, she said quietly, while cleaning the attic. Nathaniel's hands stilled, fork halfway to his mouth. I should have cleared those out before you arrived. There's no need to apologize. This was her home first. Was, he emphasized, setting down his fork. Now it's yours. The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been for such a simple statement. This was the closest they had come to acknowledging their actual marriage. Not just the arrangement, but the reality that they were husband and wife, bound not just by paper but by shared space, shared meals, shared life. Nathaniel, Abigail began, uncertainty in her voice. If you ever want to talk about her... I don't, he cut her off, his tone sharper than intended. Seeing the hurt flash across Abigail's face, he softened. I'm sorry, it's just... The past is best left buried. Some ghosts don't stay buried unless properly laid to rest, she replied gently. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Abigail thought he might open up, might share the burden that was clearly crushing him. Instead, he pushed back from the table. I need to check on a sick calf, he said, though they both knew it was an excuse. Don't wait up. After he left, Abigail cleared the table slowly, her mind churning with the knowledge she now possessed and the growing feelings she could no longer deny. Despite his gruffness, despite his emotional walls, she was falling in love with Nathaniel Hayes, his quiet strength, his hidden gentleness, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, seeing the woman beneath the scars. But loving a man who carried such guilt, who couldn't forgive himself for a tragedy beyond his control, that was a different kind of pain entirely. In the barn, Nathaniel leaned against the stall door, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and horses. There was no sick calf, just a man sick with memories he couldn't escape and feelings he didn't know how to express. Hannah's death haunted him not just because he'd lost her, but because he had failed her. He'd watched her slide into melancholy, had seen the light fade from her eyes month after barren month, and he had done nothing effective to help her. He'd thought love would be enough, that patience would see them through. He'd been wrong, and that failure had cost Hannah her life. How could he risk failing another woman that way? How could he trust himself with Abigail's happiness when he had so completely failed to preserve Hannah's? Yet each day it became harder to maintain distance. Abigail had brought warmth back to his home, purpose back to his days. The way she faced the world without flinching, despite her scars, it humbled him, made him yearn to be worthy of such courage. Talking to the horses again, Thaddeus's voice broke through his thoughts. The old man stood at the barn entrance, pipe glowing in the gathering dusk. "They're better listeners than most people," Nathaniel replied, straightening. Thaddeus ambled closer, the tap of his walking stick keeping rhythm with his slow steps. "Maybe, but they're not much for advice." He settled on a hay bale, regarding Nathaniel with shrewd eyes. "Something's eating at you, and I don't think it's fence problems." Nathaniel sighed, knowing the old man wouldn't leave without having his say. "It's complicated. Life generally is, especially when there's a woman involved. Abigail found Hannah's things today." Thaddeus was silent a moment, puffing his pipe. "And that's got you spooked because Hannah wasn't who everyone thought she was, who I let them believe she was." "You mean because she took her own life?" Nathaniel's head snapped up, shock evident in his expression. "You knew?" "I've worked this land 40 years, boy. Not much happens that I don't notice." Thaddeus's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "Found her, didn't you? That's why you've carried it so heavy." Nathaniel's throat tightened with emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. "In the creek, she'd taken all her laudanum. Left a note." His voice broke. "I should have seen it coming. Should have done something." "What exactly? Locked her up? Watched her every minute? A person determined to leave will find their way out, one way or another. I could have been something, more attentive, more understanding." Thaddeus shook his head slowly. "Hannah was troubled long before you married her. Some souls come into this world missing a piece that lets others find joy in simple things. Not your doing and not yours to fix." "She wanted a child so badly," Nathaniel whispered. "Thought it would fill whatever emptiness haunted her." "And now you're afraid of failing Abigail the same way," Thaddeus concluded. "That's what's got you running scared." Nathaniel couldn't deny it. "How can I trust myself with her happiness when I couldn't preserve Hannah's?" "Hannah's happiness wasn't yours to preserve, son. It was hers to find, and she couldn't." Thaddeus tapped his pipe against his boot, emptying the ashes. "Abigail isn't Hannah. Look at what that woman's already survived. She's got steel in her spine that Hannah never had. She deserves better than a broken man." "We're all broken somewhere, Nathaniel. The lucky ones find someone whose broken pieces fit with their own." The old man stood with a grunt. "Question is, are you brave enough to find out if yours and hers might make something whole?" He left Nathaniel alone with that thought, the barn silent except for the occasional soft nicker of horses and the steady rhythm of his own troubled heart. That night, Nathaniel's nightmares returned with savage intensity. In his dream, Hannah stood at the creek's edge, her sodden dress clinging to her body, her eyes accusatory as she pointed a pale finger toward the house, where Abigail waited, unaware of the patterns repeating themselves. He woke shouting, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets. Before his eyes could adjust to the darkness, his bedroom door opened, and Abigail appeared, a candle illuminating her concerned face. "Another nightmare?" she asked softly, approaching the bed with careful steps. Nathaniel nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. She set the candle on the nightstand and perched on the edge of the bed, close but not touching. "Would it help to talk about it?" she offered. For a moment, he almost refused again, almost retreated behind the walls he'd built so carefully. But something in her expression, compassion without pity, broke through his defenses. "It's about Hannah," he confessed, his voice rough. "She didn't die of illness, like I told you." "I know," Abigail said gently. "I found her journal." Nathaniel closed his eyes, shame washing over him. "Then you know I failed her. I watched her fade away day by day and couldn't save her." "That wasn't your failure, Nathaniel. Some wounds are beyond anyone's healing. I was her husband. I should have found a way." Abigail was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "My mother suffered from melancholy after my youngest brother was born. Nothing brought her joy, not even her children. My father tried everything, doctors, medicines, trips to different climates. Nothing helped." Her voice softened. "One winter morning, they found her in the garden, frozen. She'd walked out in her nightgown during a snowstorm." Nathaniel looked at her with new understanding. "I'm sorry. It wasn't my father's fault. It wasn't mine. Some people have wounds on the inside that never heal properly." Abigail's hand found his in the darkness. "Carrying blame for another's choices isn't honor, Nathaniel. It's another form of pride." Her words struck him like physical blows, challenging beliefs he'd held for years. "I don't know how to let her go," he admitted, his voice breaking. "You don't have to let her go," Abigail said. "Just let go of the guilt that isn't yours to carry." In the flickering candlelight, her scarred face was a landscape of shadows and strength, a physical manifestation of surviving what should have destroyed her. Without conscious thought, Nathaniel reached out, his fingertips tracing the line where smooth skin met scar tissue. "How did you get these?" he asked, the question he'd been too polite to ask for months. Abigail didn't pull away from his touch, though he felt her tremble slightly. "Chicago," she said quietly. "The Great Fire of 1871. I was 15. "You were there?" Many had heard of the devastating fire that had destroyed much of the city. She nodded. "I was working as a governess for a wealthy family. When the fire reached our neighborhood, I got the children out, but went back for the baby who had been left sleeping upstairs." Her voice grew distant, lost in memory. "The stairs collapsed as I was coming down with him. A burning beam." She gestured to her face. "This was the result." "You saved the child?" "Yes, but the family, they couldn't bear to look at me afterward. A constant reminder of their closest brush with tragedy." Her smile was sad, knowing. "They gave me a reference and a month's wages, and suggested I find a position where my appearance wouldn't distress the children." Anger flared in Nathaniel's chest at the callousness of people who could discard someone who had saved their child, as if scarred skin somehow negated heroism. "What did you do?" "What anyone does. I survived. Took positions where my face wouldn't matter. Kitchen work, laundry, positions where I was heard but not seen." She shrugged slightly. "Until I saw your advertisement. A remote ranch in Montana seemed perfect. No society to judge, no children to frighten." "And instead you got more judgment," Nathaniel said bitterly, thinking of their reception in town. "I've faced worse than small-town whispers, Nathaniel." Her hand still rested in his, neither of them acknowledging the intimacy of the touch. Fire scars the skin, but it's people who scar the soul. Their eyes met in the candlelit darkness, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. Without words, they recognized in each other the same determined survival, the same hard-won strength. "Stay," Nathaniel said suddenly. "Just stay with me a while. Not for anything improper, just not to be alone with the nightmares," she finished for him. "I understand." She settled beside him on the bed, above the covers, her back against the headboard, still holding his hand. Nathaniel closed his eyes, the warmth of another human presence beside him, more comforting than he had thought possible. They remained that way until dawn, sometimes speaking in soft murmurs about inconsequential things, sometimes silent, but connected in a way that transcended physical intimacy. When pink light began to filter through the curtains, Abigail slipped away to start breakfast, leaving Nathaniel with the lingering scent of lavender and the first peace he'd known in years. The following days brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Boundaries remained, propriety observed, but small changes appeared. Hands that lingered during the passing of a plate at dinner, conversations that extended into the evening hours, shared smiles over private jokes. They moved around each other with growing awareness, no longer avoiding contact but not quite seeking it either, a delicate dance of attraction constrained by caution. May arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the hills. The garden flourished under Abigail's care, seedlings reaching toward the strengthening sun. Nathaniel found himself creating reasons to be near the house during daylight hours, watching as Abigail worked among the plants, her sleeves rolled up, hair escaping its pins and tendrils that caught the light. One afternoon, he taught her to ride horseback, a skill she'd never acquired in her city upbringing. His hands at her waist as he helped her mount, the shared laughter when she nearly toppled from the saddle, the triumph in her eyes when she finally managed a complete circuit of the corral without assistance. These moments collected like beads on a string, a necklace of small joys neither had expected to find again. It was during this time that Thaddeus, ever observant, noticed something fall from Abigail's pocket as she hung laundry behind the house. After she returned inside, he retrieved it, an envelope addressed in elegant handwriting to Judge Ezekiel Morgan, Chicago Circuit Court. Inside was a letter filled with pain and accusation, clearly never sent. Thaddeus read enough to understand that Abigail was apparently the daughter of a prominent judge, a man who had disowned her after her disfigurement. The old man tucked the letter into his coat, troubled by this glimpse into Abigail's closely guarded past. Without mentioning his discovery to Nathaniel, he made a rare trip into Wolf Creek alone, ostensibly for supplies but with another purpose in mind. At the telegraph office, he composed a brief message to a former cavalry comrade now working for the Chicago Police Department, requesting discreet information about Judge Ezekiel Morgan and his family. It was an intrusion into Abigail's privacy, but Thaddeus had developed a protective fondness for the scarred woman who was bringing his friend back to life. If there were ghosts in her past that might threaten her future happiness, he wanted to know. Meanwhile, Ruth observed the changes in Nathaniel with quiet satisfaction. "He's shaving every day now," she told Thaddeus when he returned from town, "and I saw him checking his reflection in the window before going to the house for dinner. Like a boy courting his first sweetheart." Thaddeus agreed, though his expression remained troubled. "What's wrong?" Ruth knew her husband too well to miss his distraction. Thaddeus sighed, showing her the letter. "Our Abigail has secrets of her own. Seems she's the daughter of a Chicago judge who abandoned her after her injuries. There's anger in these words, Ruth. Deep hurt. Wouldn't you be angry if your own father cast you aside when you needed him most?" Ruth asked reasonably. "That poor child." "That's just it. I don't think she's just any judge's daughter. I've sent to Chicago for information. If I'm right, there could be complications." Ruth touched his weathered cheek affectionately. "Always looking out for everyone, Thaddeus Cooper. Let them find their way. Some paths need to be walked without well-meaning interference. And some paths lead to cliffs if there's no one watching ahead," he countered, but promised to tread carefully. On a warm evening in mid-May, Abigail finally completed the blue calico dress. She'd worked on it in private moments, each stitch a meditation on possibility, each seam a hope she barely dared acknowledge. When she put it on for the first time, the woman who gazed back from the small mirror was someone she hardly recognized. Not the disfigured governess, not the invisible servant, but a woman with worth beyond her usefulness. The dress complemented her eyes, its simple lines flattering without drawing attention to her scars. For the first time in years, Abigail felt something akin to pretty, an emotion so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. She wore it to dinner that evening. When she entered the kitchen where Nathaniel was washing up after his day's work, the look on his face was worth every careful stitch, every moment of uncertainty. He stared, words failing him completely, his eyes taking in the transformation with undisguised appreciation. "Abigail," he finally managed, her name like a prayer on his lips. "You look presentable." she offered when he trailed off, self-consciousness returning under his intense gaze. Beautiful, he corrected, the word hanging between them, honest and unadorned. Color rose in her cheeks, and she turned away to tend to the stove, but not before Nathaniel caught the pleased smile she couldn't quite suppress. It struck him then how rarely she must have heard such words since her injury, how the world had trained her to expect averted eyes rather than admiration. That night they ate on the porch, watching as fireflies began their evening dance over the fields. The air was sweet with the scent of early summer. The distant mountains purple against the darkening sky. They spoke of small things, the garden's progress, a foal born the previous week, the letter Ruth had sent inviting them to Sunday dinner. As twilight deepened into true night, their conversation drifted into companionable silence. Without discussion or acknowledgement, Abigail's hand found Nathaniel's on the bench between them, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd been reaching for each other all along. When the moon rose, full and silver over the eastern ridge, Nathaniel turned to her, his expression solemn in the pale light. "Abigail," he began, his voice low and uncertain, "I'm not good with words, never have been, but I need to tell you, these past months, having you here, it's been—" He struggled, emotional articulation never his strength. "I know," she said softly, saving him from his fumbling attempt. "For me too." Emboldened by her understanding, he continued, "When you came, I thought we were making a practical arrangement. I never expected to feel— I never thought I could." "Nor did I," she admitted, her thumb tracing gentle patterns on his palm. "I came here expecting nothing but shelter and work. I've found so much more." He lifted their joined hands, pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture of such tender reverence that Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm still afraid," he confessed against her skin, "of failing you, of not being what you deserve. And I'm afraid of being a disappointment," she whispered back, "of being too broken to love properly." Nathaniel cupped her face with his free hand, his touch gentle on her scarred cheek. "You could never disappoint me, Abigail Hayes. Never." In the moonlight, with crickets providing a gentle symphony and the vast Montana sky arching overhead, their lips met in a tentative first kiss, a meeting of souls as much as bodies, a promise made without words. The ghost that had haunted them both seemed to recede, pushed back by the simple, profound realization that broken pieces sometimes fit together to create something stronger than either had been alone. When they separated, Abigail rested her forehead against his, eyes closed, memorizing the moment in all its sensory detail. The scent of pine and leather that clung to Nathaniel's clothes, the roughness of his calloused hand against her cheek, the distant call of a night bird, the way her heart seemed to have found its proper rhythm at last. "We should go in," Nathaniel said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "It's getting late." Abigail nodded but remained where she was, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. "A few more minutes," she requested, and he was happy to oblige, drawing her close against his side as they watched the stars emerge, each privately marveling at the unexpected gift they had found in each other. Later, as they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, propriety still governing their actions despite the shift in their relationship, Nathaniel caught Abigail's hand in the hallway. "I meant what I said," he told her earnestly, "about not being good with words. But I want you to know that He paused, gathering courage. "I care for you, Abigail. More than I thought possible." She smiled, the expression transforming her face, making the scars seem inconsequential compared to the light in her eyes. "I care for you too, Nathaniel. More than is wise, perhaps." "Wisdom's overrated," he replied, drawing a soft laugh from her that he felt like sunshine in his soul. One more brief, tender kiss, and they parted. Nathaniel to the main bedroom, Abigail to her small room off the kitchen, both carrying a new warmth that made the physical separation easier to bear. Unknown to the couple, their emerging happiness faced threats from multiple directions. In Wolf Creek, Victor Blackwood had begun asking pointed questions about the scarred woman at Hayes Ranch, his interest aroused by rumors of Nathaniel's obvious attention to his mail-order bride. Blackwood's desire for Hannah had never fully abated, and his resentment toward Nathaniel for stealing her had festered for years. The idea that Hayes might find happiness again with a disfigured nobody no less, grated on Blackwood's sense of justice. Meanwhile, in Chicago, wheels had been set in motion by Thaddeus's telegraph. Information was being gathered, connections made, with repercussions that would soon reach all the way to the Montana Territory. And closer to home, as Thaddeus returned from checking the north pasture one afternoon, he noticed a rider approaching the main house, a stranger in a city suit, his horse bearing the livery stables mark from Wolf Creek. The old man changed direction, urging his mount toward the unexpected visitor with a sense of foreboding. He arrived as the stranger was dismounting, Abigail standing frozen on the porch, her face pale beneath her scars. "Afternoon," Thaddeus called, deliberately casual as he assessed the situation. "Don't often get visitors out this way." The man turned, revealing a lean face with calculating eyes and an expensive haircut. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for Miss Abigail Morgan. I was told in town she might be found here." "And who might be asking?" Thaddeus kept his tone friendly, but positioned his horse between the stranger and the porch steps. "Edward Wells, representing the law offices of Harrington and Burke, Chicago." The man produced a card from his vest pocket. "It's a matter of some importance regarding the estate of the late Judge Ezekiel Morgan." At this, Abigail's hand gripped the porch railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. "My father is dead?" Her voice was faint, a complex mixture of emotions making it impossible to determine if this was welcome or devastating news. "3 weeks ago, ma'am," Wells confirmed, studying her scarred face with barely concealed curiosity. "Heart failure, and now I find myself in the rather unexpected position of locating his heir, previously believed deceased." "Heir?" Abigail echoed, confusion evident. "Yes, ma'am. According to the judge's will, his entire estate, which is substantial, passes to his only child, Abigail Morgan, presumed lost in the Great Chicago Fire, but now, it seems, very much alive." Thaddeus watched Abigail carefully, noting the shock and conflicting emotions crossing her face. "Perhaps this discussion would be better continued inside," he suggested, dismounting with a grunt. "After Mr. Wells has properly identified himself and his business." The lawyer produced several official-looking documents, which Thaddeus examined with surprising thoroughness for a ranch hand. "These seem in order," he finally allowed, "though Nathaniel should be here for this conversation." "Nathaniel is checking the south herd," Abigail said, finding her voice again. "He won't be back until evening." "Then perhaps you'd allow me to stay until he returns," Wells said smoothly. "The matter of your inheritance is complex and requires careful discussion." Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "Please come in, Mr. Wells. I'll prepare some refreshments while you wait." As she turned to enter the house, Wells muttered under his breath, though not quietly enough to escape Thaddeus's sharp hearing. "So the rumors were true. Judge Morgan's daughter lives. Hideously scarred, but unmistakably her mother's child in the eyes." Thaddeus's weathered face hardened, but he said nothing, merely followed the city lawyer into the house with the wary vigilance of an old wolf protecting its pack. Inside, as Abigail busied herself with coffee and what remained of yesterday's apple cake, Wells examined the modest ranch house with barely concealed disdain. "Quite a change from your father's mansion on Prairie Avenue," he observed. "Though I suppose any port in a storm, as they say." Abigail's movements stilled momentarily before she resumed her preparations with deliberate calm. "Horizon Ranch is my home now, Mr. Wells. By choice, not necessity." "Of course," he replied, his tone suggesting otherwise. "Still, when you understand the extent of your inheritance, property in Chicago's finest neighborhoods, investments, bank accounts, you might reconsider your situation." "Wah," Thaddeus, leaning against the doorframe with deceptive casualness, interjected. "Mrs. Hayes is well situated here. Married to a good man, respected in the community." Wells's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Hayes, I was given to understand. That is, in town they referred to you as the mail-order bride with the unfortunate face." The crude description landed like a physical blow. Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. "My marriage to Mr. Hayes began as an arrangement, yes. It has become much more." "I see." Wells's expression suggested he saw entirely too much. "Well, that complicates matters somewhat, though not insurmountably. The judge's will specifically names Abigail Morgan, not Abigail Hayes. There could be legal questions about your husband's access to the inheritance." "Nathaniel has no interest in my father's money," Abigail said with quiet dignity. Perhaps not, Wells conceded. But the law has its requirements. And there is the matter of the letter. Letter? Your father left a sealed letter with instructions that it be delivered to you personally, should you be found alive. I have it here. He reached into his jacket, producing an envelope bearing the Morgan family seal. Abigail stared at it as if it might bite. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted it, her expression unreadable. Thank you. I'll read it privately. Of course. Wells sipped his coffee. I should mention, there is a time sensitivity to settling the estate. The judge's second cousin, Harrison Morgan, is contesting the will, claiming you must be an imposter since Abigail Morgan perished in 1871. If you wish to claim your rightful inheritance, you'll need to return to Chicago within the month to establish your identity before the probate court. The implications hung heavy in the room. Return to Chicago, leave Horizon Ranch, leave Nathaniel, face the ghosts of a past she had spent years trying to escape. I'll need to discuss this with my husband, Abigail said finally. Naturally. Wells set down his cup. I'll be staying at the Wolf Creek Hotel for 3 days. Afterward, I must return to Chicago to report to my superiors. With or without you, Mrs. Hayes. The subtle emphasis on her married name carried an undercurrent of challenge, as if Wells already doubted she would maintain that identity once the full extent of her inheritance became clear. After he departed, with Thaddeus escorting him to the property line to ensure he truly left, Abigail sank into a kitchen chair, her father's letter unopened before her. The past she had tried so hard to leave behind had found her after all, bringing with it choices she had never expected to face. When Nathaniel returned at dusk, tired and dusty from his day's work, he found her still sitting there, the letter untouched, her expression troubled in ways he had never seen before. Abigail, what's wrong? She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a complex mixture of emotions, uncertainty, fear, and something deeper that made his heart constrict painfully in his chest. My father is dead, she said simply, and everything has changed. The world seemed to pause between her words and his response, a pivotal moment where past and future hung in perfect, precarious balance. Whatever came next would forever alter the fragile happiness they had begun to build together. The question wasn't whether they would weather this storm, but who they would be when it finally passed. In the fading light of day, Nathaniel crossed the threshold, closing the distance between them both physically and emotionally. What awaited them would not be faced alone. Nathaniel stood motionless in the doorway, dust from the day's work still clinging to his clothes, as he absorbed Abigail's words. The kitchen lamp cast long shadows across her troubled face, highlighting the tension in her posture as she sat before the unopened letter. Your father? He repeated, crossing to her side. The judge who abandoned you after the fire? Abigail nodded, her fingers tracing the wax seal on the envelope without breaking it. Judge Ezekiel Morgan of the Chicago Circuit Court, dead of heart failure 3 weeks ago. Her voice remained steady, but Nathaniel detected the complex emotions beneath. Grief not for the man who had died, but perhaps for the father she had needed and never truly had. How did you learn this? He pulled a chair beside her, concern etching deeper lines in his weathered face. A lawyer named Wells came from Chicago. She explained the unexpected visit, the news of her inheritance, the demand that she return to Chicago to claim what was rightfully hers. Throughout her explanation, Nathaniel's expression darkened, particularly at the mention of Wells' disdainful attitude toward their home and marriage. What will you do? He asked when she had finished, the question hanging between them like a physical presence. Abigail's eyes met his, uncertainty evident in their blue depths. I don't know. I haven't even read his letter yet. She gestured to the envelope. I'm afraid of what it might say, or what it might not say. You don't owe him your forgiveness, Nathaniel said quietly. Not even in death. No, she agreed, but I might owe myself the closure. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper within. The handwriting was bold, authoritative, much like the man had been in life. Abigail read silently, her expression shifting from apprehension to disbelief as she progressed through the contents. He knew I was alive, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. All these years he knew. How? Nathaniel moved closer, not touching the letter but offering his presence as support. The detective he hired found me at the hospital after the fire. He reported that I was severely disfigured, but recovering. Her voice took on a bitter edge. Father decided it would be kinder to let the world believe I had died, rather than face life with my affliction. He arranged for falsified death records and provided funds for my care through intermediaries who never revealed the source. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, anger flaring on her behalf. He lied to the world about his own daughter because he was ashamed of your scars? Not just ashamed. Abigail continued reading, her voice growing more strained. He writes that he could not bear to see me suffer the stares and rejection that would inevitably follow. That he loved me too much to witness my diminished prospects. A harsh laugh escaped her. Such convenient love, that it could be expressed only through absence and denial. She handed Nathaniel the letter, allowing him to read the carefully composed justifications of a man who had abandoned his child when she needed him most, while claiming it was for her own good. The final paragraphs of the letter contained a confession of sorts. I have followed your life from afar, Abigail, through reports from those I paid to ensure your welfare without revealing my involvement. I know of your struggles, your persistence, your eventual journey west to marry a rancher in Montana Territory. I know that I have no right to your forgiveness. Indeed, I do not ask for it, but I do ask that you accept what is rightfully yours, the fortune that should have supported you all these years had my cowardice not prevented it. If nothing else, consider it restitution for a father's greatest failure. Perhaps, in claiming your inheritance, you might find it in your heart to remember that I loved you in the only way my flawed character allowed. Not enough to stand beside you in adversity, but enough to provide for you in death as I should have in life. Coward, Nathaniel muttered, returning the letter to Abigail. He speaks of love while admitting he couldn't bear to look at you. At least he acknowledges his failure. Abigail carefully refolded the letter, her emotions too complex for simple expression. That's more than I expected. Will you go to Chicago? It was the question that truly mattered, the one that had hung unspoken between them since she first mentioned the lawyer's visit. Abigail's answer would determine not just the fate of an inheritance, but potentially their future together. She looked around the kitchen, at the home she had transformed with her care, at the man who had come to mean everything to her despite their unlikely beginnings. I don't know, she admitted. The money means nothing to me. But there are questions I've carried for 14 years that only Chicago might answer. Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes despite the fears she could see lurking behind them. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Even if I need to go to Chicago? He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. Even then. But Abigail, I need to know. He paused, vulnerability naked on his face. Would you come back? The question laid bare his deepest fear, that once she reclaimed her place as the daughter of wealth and privilege, once she had options beyond a one-armed rancher and a remote Montana homestead, she would choose differently. Abigail rose from her chair and moved to stand before him, taking his face between her hands. Nathaniel Hayes, this is my home now. You are my home. No inheritance, no matter how vast, could change that. Relief washed over his features, and he pulled her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words of his fear of losing her. They remained that way for long moments, her head against his chest, his face buried in her hair, each drawing strength from the other's presence. We'll face this together, he promised, whatever comes. Morning brought Thaddeus and Ruth to the main house, concern evident in their lined faces as they joined Nathaniel and Abigail for coffee around the kitchen table. Nathaniel had sent word with the ranch hand who delivered the milk, knowing their friends deserved to be part of any decision. I don't trust that lawyer fella, Thaddeus said bluntly after Abigail explained her father's letter. Too smooth by half, and he was asking questions in town before coming here. About you, about the ranch, about your marriage. What kind of questions? Nathaniel asked, his protective instincts aroused. Whether you two were legally married, how long you'd been here, whether you seemed... Thaddeus hesitated, glancing apologetically at Abigail. Content with your situation. He's building a case, Ruth observed shrewdly, trying to suggest Abigail might not be in her right mind, or might be under undue influence. If he can create doubt about her identity or her freedom to make decisions, he could delay the inheritance proceedings. But why? Abigail frowned. He's just a lawyer representing my father's estate. Lawyers get paid, Thaddeus reminded her. The longer the estate remains in probate, the more fees his firm collects. And if this cousin, Harrison Morgan, Abigail supplied, if this Harrison fellow gains control instead, perhaps the firm expects more lucrative business from him than from you. Nathaniel's expression darkened. So they're trying to manipulate Abigail into returning to Chicago, where they can better control the situation. Or discredit her if she refuses, Ruth added. A woman who chooses to live on a remote ranch with a husband she barely knows, rather than claim a fortune, they could suggest mental instability. Abigail's hands tightened around her coffee cup. They can't force me to do anything. No, Thaddeus agreed, but they can make things difficult. Legal challenges to your marriage, questions about property rights, perhaps even attempts to have you declared incompetent to manage your affairs. They wouldn't dare, Nathaniel growled. Money makes people dare a great deal, Ruth said softly. And from what you've said, there's a considerable amount at stake. Silence fell over the table as they contemplated the implications. Finally, Abigail spoke. I need to go to Chicago, she said with quiet determination. Not for the money, but to face my past on my own terms. If I hide here, I'll always be running from something. Nathaniel reached for her hand across the table. Not alone. I'm coming with you. She turned to him in surprise. But the ranch can manage without me for a few weeks. Thaddeus and the hands know what needs doing. The old man nodded. We'll keep things running. You two need to settle this business properly, together. A united front gives them less room to maneuver, Ruth observed practically. They'll find it harder to challenge your marriage if Nathaniel is there beside you. Decision made, preparations began in earnest. The journey to Chicago would take nearly a week by train, and they would need to be prepared for an extended stay while legal matters were resolved. Nathaniel arranged for additional hands to help Thaddeus with the spring work, while Abigail and Ruth focused on appropriate clothing for city appearances. As they worked, Abigail found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of returning to Chicago. The city where she had lost everything, where her face had been forever changed, where her father had decided she was better dead than disfigured. She tried to hide her anxiety, but Nathaniel noticed, as he increasingly noticed everything about her. The night before they were to leave for Wolf Creek to catch the eastbound train, he found her on the porch, staring at the stars that sparkled with particular brilliance in the clear mountain air. Second thoughts? He asked, settling beside her on the bench they had come to think of as theirs. Not about going, she clarified, about what we might find, about facing people who knew me before. She gestured to her scarred face. People who'll look at me with pity or revulsion, comparing me to the girl I used to be. Nathaniel considered this, understanding better than most the weight of others' perceptions. When I came back from the war, he said slowly, missing my arm, I couldn't stand the way people looked at me, especially those who had known me before. Their pity felt worse than the phantom pain. Abigail turned to him, silently encouraging him to continue. I nearly drank myself to death that first year, hiding away from everyone. It was Hannah who finally said something that made a difference. He looked out at the darkened landscape, remembering. She said, their pity isn't about you, Nate. It's about them. Their fear of suffering, what you've suffered, their relief that it wasn't them. You don't have to carry their feelings along with your own. Wise words, Abigail murmured. They were, and they applied to you too. He took her hand, rubbing his thumb across her knuckles in a gesture that had become familiar and comforting to them both. The people of Chicago, they'll see your scars and react according to their own fears and prejudices. But that's not about you, Abigail. It never was. It's hard to remember that when faced with stares and whispers. I know, but you'll have me beside you, seeing the real you. And you're so much more than what happened to your face. His voice grew rough with emotion. You're the woman who made this house a home again, who faces each day with courage I can only aspire to, who sees value in a broken-down rancher when others see only what he's lost. Tears filled Abigail's eyes at his words. When you look at me like that, I almost forget the scars exist. That's because when I look at you, I see Abigail, all of you, not just one part. He leaned forward, pressing his lips gently to her scarred cheek. And all of you is beautiful to me. She turned her face to meet his lips with her own, the kiss deepening with a newfound urgency, as if they both sensed the challenges that lay ahead and sought to anchor themselves in each other before facing them. When they finally separated, breathless and flushed, despite the cool evening air, Abigail rested her forehead against his. "I'm still afraid," she admitted, "but less so with you beside me." "That's all I ask," Nathaniel said, holding her close as the Montana night enfolded them in its vast, star-studded embrace. "To be beside you, whatever comes." The journey to Chicago was long and increasingly uncomfortable as they traveled east. Abigail wore her veils in public, an armor against curious stares, but they could not entirely shield her from the world's intrusive interest. Nathaniel remained steadfastly at her side, his protective presence a buffer between her and those who would gawk or comment. As they approached the city, Abigail grew more withdrawn, memories surfacing with each mile closer to her former home. The train windows framed an ever-changing landscape that grew progressively more industrial and crowded, until finally they were pulling into the cavernous Union Station, steam hissing around the slowing train as it arrived at its final destination. "We're here," Nathaniel said unnecessarily, gathering their modest luggage with his one good arm. He studied Abigail's face, what he could see of it behind her veil. "Ready?" She nodded, straightening her shoulders beneath her best traveling suit. One she and Ruth had altered from an old dress of Hannah's, updated with trim from Abigail's blue calico. "As ready as I'll ever be." They emerged onto the platform into a cacophony of noise and activity that immediately set Nathaniel on edge. After years of Montana's vast spaces and relative solitude, Chicago's crowds and clamor felt overwhelming. He could only imagine how it affected Abigail, returning to this chaos after so long away. A uniformed porter approached, offering assistance with their bags. As Nathaniel negotiated the fee, Abigail stood slightly apart, taking in her surroundings with evident discomfort. She did not see the well-dressed man observing her from across the platform, his gaze calculating as it took in her veiled figure and the one-armed rancher beside her. They secured a modest hotel room near the business district, using funds Nathaniel had carefully saved over the years. Though the accommodations were far from luxurious, they were clean and respectable, important considerations for maintaining appearances during the coming legal proceedings. "We should notify Wells of our arrival," Abigail said as they settled into their room. "The sooner we begin, the sooner we can return home." Nathaniel nodded, though concern lingered in his eyes. "Are you certain you're ready to face him? We could take a day to rest after the journey." "Delay won't make it easier," she replied with the practical determination he had come to admire. "Besides, I'd rather catch them off guard. They're expecting me to arrive alone, if at all." "Very well." He straightened his tie, an unfamiliar constraint after ranch life. "Let's show these city lawyers what Montana folk are made of." The offices of Harrington and Burke occupied an imposing building on LaSalle Street, its marble foyer and polished brass fixtures declaring success and permanence to all who entered. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Abigail's veil and Nathaniel's empty sleeve, but his well-practiced professional demeanor quickly reasserted itself. "Mrs. Hayes to see Mr. Wells," Abigail announced, her voice steady despite the anxiety Nathaniel could sense in her rigid posture. "He's expecting me, though perhaps not quite so soon." "One moment, please." The young man disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with Edward Wells himself, whose surprise at their appearance was poorly concealed. "Mrs. Hayes," he greeted, his gaze shifting between her and Nathaniel. "And Mr. Hayes, I presume. This is unexpected." "My wife doesn't travel alone," Nathaniel stated simply, his tone making it clear this was non-negotiable. "Of course." Wells' smile didn't reach his eyes. "Please come to my office. We have much to discuss." He led them through corridors lined with law books and framed credentials, past offices where other attorneys glanced up curiously at the unusual visitors. Wells' own office was impressively appointed, with leather-bound volumes, a massive oak desk, and windows overlooking the bustling street below. "I must say I'm surprised by your prompt arrival," Wells admitted as they seated themselves in visitor chairs. "Most clients require more consideration before undertaking such a journey." "I'm not most clients," Abigail replied, "and I prefer to resolve matters efficiently." "Indeed." Wells shuffled papers on his desk, clearly reassessing his approach. Well, since you're here, we should proceed with establishing your identity formally. I've arranged for a hearing before Judge Hamilton 3 days from now. Several individuals who knew Abigail Morgan before the fire will be present to confirm your identity. And who might those be? Nathaniel asked, his protective instincts aroused by the thought of Abigail facing people from her past. Your father's former housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, who helped raise you. Your childhood piano teacher, Mr. Levinson. And your father's personal physician, Dr. Grayson, who treated you as a child and has medical records that may help confirm your identity. Abigail tensed at these names, memories flooding back. Mrs. Simmons, she murmured. Is she still alive? Very much so, and quite eager to see you again. Wells leaned forward. She was devastated when told of your death. Learning you survived has been emotional for her. For the first time since their arrival, Abigail's composure wavered. Mrs. Simmons had been the closest thing to a mother she had known after her own mother's death when Abigail was 7. The thought of seeing her again brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Nathaniel, sensing her emotion, placed his hand over hers. What happens after this hearing? He asked, giving her a moment to collect herself. Assuming Mrs. Hayes' identity is confirmed, and I have little doubt it will be, the estate can move into probate proper. There will be inventories to review, properties to inspect, investment accounts to transfer. The process could take several weeks, possibly months. Months? Nathaniel frowned. That's not possible. We have a ranch to run. Wells spread his hands in a gesture of helpless bureaucracy. The law proceeds at its own pace, Mr. Hayes, especially with an estate of this magnitude. Is my presence required for all of it? Abigail asked, her voice steady once more. Could some matters be handled through correspondence? Some, perhaps, but significant decisions would require your signature, verified by witnesses. Wells hesitated. There's also the matter of Harrison Morgan's challenge. He's quite determined to contest the will, claiming you are an imposter. On what grounds? Nathaniel demanded. If these witnesses can confirm her identity, he suggests that perhaps they are mistaken, or that Mrs. Hayes has somehow deceived them. Wells' gaze shifted to Abigail's veil. He's particularly focused on the changes to your appearance since the fire. Suggests that without clear proof, such as birthmarks or other identifying features not altered by your injuries, there can be no certainty. The implication was clear. Her scarred face, the very thing that had caused her father to reject her, was now being used to question her claim to his estate. That's outrageous, Nathaniel growled, his hand tightening on Abigail's. Perhaps, Wells conceded, but effective nonetheless. Judge Hamilton will expect substantial evidence beyond mere recognition. Personal memories, knowledge of the Morgan household, physical confirmation where possible. Abigail lifted her chin, dignity evident even behind her veil. I have nothing to hide, Mr. Wells, including my scars. I am Abigail Morgan Hayes, and I'm prepared to prove it in whatever way necessary. Wells studied her for a moment, something like admiration flickering briefly in his eyes. Very well. I'll provide a complete file of documents for you to review before the hearing. Is there anything else you require in the meantime? Yes, Abigail said. I'd like to visit my father's grave. The request seemed to surprise Wells. Of course, he's interred at Graceland Cemetery in the Morgan family plot. I can arrange transportation if you wish. That won't be necessary. We'll make our own way. She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. We'll return tomorrow to review those documents. As they left the imposing building, Nathaniel studied Abigail's profile through her veil. Are you all right? No, she admitted quietly, but I will be. This is just the beginning, Nathaniel. The real battle starts when we face Harrison Morgan and his allegations. We'll face him together, Nathaniel reminded her, offering his arm as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. And Abigail, I'm proud of you for standing your ground in there. She leaned slightly against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I never thought I'd come back here. Never thought I'd have to face these ghosts. Some ghosts need facing, he said gently, as I learned with Hannah. They walked in companionable silence for several blocks, each lost in thought, until Abigail suddenly stopped, her attention caught by something across the street. What is it? Nathaniel asked, following her gaze to an elegant townhouse with ivy climbing its brick facade. That was our home, she whispered. Where I grew up, where I lived until... Until the fire, until her father abandoned her, until her life changed irrevocably. Without discussion, they crossed the street, stopping before the wrought iron gate that separated the small front garden from the sidewalk. Abigail stared at this building, emotions warring on what was visible of her face. "It looks exactly the same," she murmured, as if 14 years haven't passed at all. Nathaniel remained silent, understanding that this moment belonged to Abigail alone, a confrontation with her past that no one else could fully share. A movement at an upstairs window caught their attention. A woman peered down at them, curiosity evident in her expression. Moments later, the front door opened, and the same woman, middle-aged, comfortably dressed in a housekeeper's attire, stepped onto the porch. "May I help you?" she called, her tone suggesting she was accustomed to curious onlookers examining the historic home. Abigail hesitated, then called back, "I was just remembering. I lived here once, many years ago." The woman's expression shifted to polite interest. "Did you? The Morgan family owned this house for generations before selling it after the judge's daughter died in the Great Fire. Such a tragedy." "Yes," Abigail said softly, "a tragedy." Something in her voice must have conveyed more than her words, for the housekeeper descended the steps, approaching the gate. "Did you know the family?" Abigail reached up and lifted her veil, revealing her scarred face to the woman's widening eyes. "I was the family," she said simply. "I'm Abigail Morgan." The housekeeper gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. "But that's impossible. Abigail Morgan died in 1871. "No," Nathaniel interjected gently. "She survived, but her father found it more convenient to let the world believe otherwise." The woman's shocked expression gradually shifted to something like understanding as she studied Abigail's face. "The right side, just like they said in the old stories. But your eyes, they're the same. The Morgan blue." "You know about my family?" Abigail asked. "The current owners are historians. They've researched the house's past thoroughly, including the Morgan family's history." She hesitated, then made a decision. Would you like to come in? I'm sure they would be fascinated to meet you." Abigail looked to Nathaniel, uncertainty in her eyes. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "We can come back another time if you prefer." After a moment's consideration, Abigail shook her head. "Thank you for the offer, but not today. Perhaps after the legal matters are settled." The housekeeper nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, but please, if you do wish to visit, you would be most welcome. The house has many stories, and now, it seems, another remarkable chapter." They continued their walk, Abigail lost in memories triggered by familiar streets and landmarks. Eventually, they found themselves at the edge of what had once been the Burn District, where the Great Fire had devoured thousands of buildings and forever altered the city's landscape. "It happened here," Abigail said, stopping at a particular intersection. "The Cartwrights' home, the family I worked for, was just there." She pointed to what was now a modern commercial building. "The baby's nursery was on the second floor, rear corner. When the fire reached us, I got the older children out first, then went back for little Thomas." Nathaniel listened silently, understanding that this recounting was necessary for her, a purging of memories long suppressed. "The stairs collapsed as I was coming down with him. A burning beam fell. Her hand unconsciously rose to her scarred cheek. I don't remember much after that. Just pain and voices saying I'd never survive. But I did." She turned to Nathaniel, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I survived, and now I'm here again, standing on the very spot where my life changed forever." "And you're still standing," Nathaniel observed softly. "Still strong, still beautiful." She smiled at him then, a genuine smile that transformed her face, scars and all. "Yes, still standing. Thanks in no small part to you." They continued toward their hotel, the shadows lengthening as afternoon deepened toward evening. Neither noticed the man who had followed them from the law offices, observing their interactions and making careful note of their movements. When they entered their hotel, he remained outside, watching the building for several minutes before turning away, his expression thoughtful as he headed toward a more exclusive part of the city. Harrison Morgan's mansion on Prairie Avenue stood as a testament to old money and careful preservation of status. The man who had followed Nathaniel and Abigail, a private investigator named Silas Reed, was shown immediately to the study upon his arrival. "Well, Harrison demanded without preamble, barely looking up from his desk. At 50, he bore the distinguished appearance of a Morgan, with silver-streaked dark hair and the family's characteristic blue eyes, though his held none of the warmth that had animated Abigail's. They've arrived earlier than expected, Reed reported. Already met with Wells at the firm. She's also visited the old Morgan house on Dearborn Street. This information finally earned Harrison's full attention. Did anyone see her? The current housekeeper spoke with her briefly, seemed quite taken with her story. Harrison cursed softly. And the husband? What's he like? Exactly as described, one-armed rancher, protective of his wife. Doesn't say much, but watches everything. Not a man to underestimate despite his disability. Is she truly Ezekiel's daughter? Your honest assessment? Reed considered the question carefully. The right eye color, the right age, knows details about the house that would be difficult to fabricate. And the scars? He shrugged. They match the description from the hospital reports. If she's an imposter, she's exceptionally well prepared. Harrison's expression darkened. That's not what I wanted to hear, Reed. I understand, sir. But you asked for my honest assessment. Yes, well, Harrison rose, moving to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter. The scars may work in our favor. After 14 years, who can be certain of a face so changed? And there's still the matter of her mental state to consider. Sir, a woman who chooses a primitive existence in Montana over her rightful place in society? Who marries a crippled rancher through a mail-order arrangement? These are not the actions of a stable mind. Harrison swirled his brandy, satisfaction evident in his expression. Dr. Whitmore has already agreed to testify regarding the potential psychological effects of severe trauma and isolation. If we can't disprove her identity, we can at least challenge her competence to manage the estate. Reed shifted uncomfortably. With respect, sir, she seemed perfectly rational during my observation. Clear-headed, articulate, aware of her surroundings. Your observations are noted, Reed, but I'm not paying you for psychological evaluations. Harrison's tone grew dismissive. Continue monitoring them. I want to know everyone they meet with, everywhere they roam. If there's even a hint of impropriety or unusual behavior, I want it documented. Yes, sir. Reed accepted his dismissal, but paused at the door. There is one other thing you should know. They plan to visit Judge Morgan's grave tomorrow. A flicker of something like concern crossed Harrison's features. Make sure you're there. I want to know exactly how she reacts. The following morning dawned gray and threatening, with low clouds promising rain by afternoon. Nathaniel and Abigail took a hired cab to Graceland Cemetery, its rolling landscape dotted with elaborate monuments and mausoleums that housed Chicago's most prominent families. The Morgan family plot occupied a prime location near the Central Lake, marked by a substantial granite obelisk bearing the family name. Newer than the surrounding monuments was a simple but elegant headstone, Ezekiel James Morgan, 1820-1885, respected jurist, beloved father. Abigail stood before it, her expression unreadable, as rain began to fall in gentle drops, seeping through her veil and mingling with the tears she could no longer contain. Beloved father, she read aloud, her voice breaking on the words. What a beautiful fiction. Nathaniel stood slightly behind her, offering silent support while giving her space for this private reckoning. I rehearsed this moment so many times over the years, she continued, speaking to the grave as if her father might hear. All the accusations I would make, all the anger I would express. I imagined myself refusing to shed a single tear for the man who couldn't bear the sight of his own daughter's scars. The rain fell harder now, darkening the granite of the headstone. But now that I'm here, I find I don't have the energy for rage anymore. It's too exhausting to hate you, Father. She reached out, her gloved fingers tracing the engraved letters of his name. I'm not here for your money. I'm here to reclaim myself, the parts of me you tried to bury along with my supposed remains. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Nathaniel moved closer, concerned about the worsening weather, but Abigail continued her one-sided conversation. I found love, Feather, real love, that sees beyond scars, that doesn't hide behind convenient excuses. I found a man who values strength over perfection, who understands that broken pieces can still create something beautiful. She looked back at Nathaniel, drawing him closer with her gaze. I found a home where I belong completely, not despite my scars, but with them as part of who I am. She knelt, placing a single white rose on the grave, not a gesture of forgiveness, but of release. Goodbye, Father. I'm letting go of this girl you couldn't accept and embracing the woman I've become without you. As she rose, Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, sheltering her as best he could from the intensifying rain. They turned away from the grave together, heading back toward the cemetery entrance, their figures gradually disappearing into the misty downpour. From behind a nearby monument, Silas Reed lowered the small notebook where he'd been recording his observations. Something in Abigail's words and demeanor had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. The genuine emotion, the dignity with which she addressed her father's betrayal, these were not the actions of an imposter or someone mentally unsound. For the first time since accepting Harrison Morgan's assignment, Reed questioned whether he was on the right side of this conflict. The day of the hearing arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself approved of Abigail's quest for justice. The courtroom was modestly filled, mostly legal representatives and court officials, but also a small gallery of curious onlookers drawn by rumors of the scandalous case. Abigail sat beside Nathaniel at the plaintiff's table, her veils discarded. She had decided that morning, with his full support, to face the proceedings with her scars visible to all. No more hiding, she had declared. Let them see who I truly am. The familiar tapestry of scars that marked her right side caught the light differently today, not as a disfigurement, but as a testament to survival. The years had softened nothing about their appearance, yet everything about how she carried them. Across the aisle, Harrison Morgan sat with his attorneys, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes continually drifting to Abigail with barely disguised calculation. He had not approached her directly, though his legal team had made overtures about a potential settlement, offers that Wells had advised them to reject as insultingly inadequate. Judge Hamilton entered, and the proceedings began with formal introductions and a summary of the case. Wells presented a compelling opening statement, outlining the evidence supporting Abigail's claim to be Ezekiel Morgan's daughter and rightful heir. Harrison's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Blackstone, countered with insinuations about convenient timing, questioned identities, and the suspicious circumstances of Abigail's reappearance after 14 years of presumed death. The witnesses were called one by one. Mrs. Simmons, now in her 70s but still formidable, burst into tears upon seeing Abigail, embracing her with such genuine emotion that even the most skeptical observers seemed moved. Her testimony about the distinctive birthmark behind Abigail's left ear, a small crescent shape unchanged by the fire, provided physical evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. Mr. Levinson, the piano teacher, recalled specific lessons in Abigail's particular difficulty with Chopin's preludes, details so personal and obscure that they added further credibility to her claim. Dr. Grayson confirmed childhood illnesses and injuries documented in his records, including a broken wrist at age 9 that had healed with a slight telltale bump still visible on Abigail's arm. Throughout these testimonies, Nathaniel sat beside Abigail, his steady presence a source of strength. When Harrison's attorney attempted to suggest that Abigail's marriage was a convenient arrangement designed to exploit the Morgan fortune, Nathaniel's dignified response, "Sir, I own a successful ranch outright and have never needed any woman's money," drew approving murmurs from the gallery. By mid-afternoon, the weight of evidence had shifted decidedly in Abigail's favor. Harrison, sensing the direction of the proceedings, conferred urgently with his attorney during a brief recess. When court resumed, Blackstone introduced his final witness, Dr. Whitmore, a psychiatrist who had never met Abigail but was prepared to testify about trauma-induced delusions and their potential impact on decision-making capacity. "Your Honor," Blackstone began, "while we do not concede that Mrs. Hayes is indeed Abigail Morgan, even if she were, there are serious concerns about her mental capacity to manage such a substantial estate." "Objection!" Wells rose immediately. "Dr. Whitmore has never examined my client and has no standing to offer such speculation." "I'll allow limited testimony," Judge Hamilton ruled, "but Dr. Whitmore, you will confine your statements to general medical principles, not specific conclusions about Mrs. Hayes." The psychiatrist, a pompous man with a heavily waxed mustache, took the stand and launched into an academic discourse on trauma, isolation, and vulnerability to manipulation. His implication was clear, that even if Abigail were the genuine heir, her experiences might have rendered her incapable of sound judgment, particularly regarding financial matters. Nathaniel felt Abigail tense beside him as the testimony continued. The doctor's clinical dissection of trauma victims, reducing her life experiences to pathology. He squeezed her hand supportively, his anger barely contained, as Whitmore suggested that Abigail's marriage and life choices indicated potential mental instability. When Wells began his cross-examination, he surprised everyone by calling Abigail herself to respond to the psychiatrist's claims. "Mrs. Hayes," he began gently, "would you explain to the court your decision to settle in Montana?" Abigail rose, her scarred face composed as she faced the courtroom. "After the fire, I spent years working in positions where I could remain hidden. Kitchens, laundries, back rooms of businesses. I lived in constant fear of judgment and rejection." Her clear voice carried throughout the courtroom. "When I saw Mr. Hayes' advertisement for a wife, I recognized an opportunity for a different life, one where I might build something meaningful away from the cruelty of city society." "And your marriage? Was it merely an arrangement of convenience?" A soft smile touched her lips as she glanced at Nathaniel. "It began as an arrangement, yes, but it has become the greatest blessing of my life. My husband sees me, truly sees me, not as a collection of scars or a victim of tragedy, but as a woman of value and strength." "Would you describe your life in Montana as isolated or primitive, as Dr. Whitmore suggested?" "I would describe it as honest," Abigail replied. "There is nothing primitive about hard work, mutual respect, and genuine connection. Our ranch is remote by Chicago standards perhaps, but it is filled with more authentic humanity than I ever found in society drawing rooms." Her quiet dignity and articulate responses were clearly affecting the courtroom. Even Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat as she continued. "As for my capacity to manage financial matters, I have kept the accounts for our ranch for months now, balancing budgets and making investment decisions alongside my husband. I may not have been raised to run a business empire, but I am neither incompetent nor easily manipulated." Judge Hamilton leaned forward, addressing Abigail directly for the first time. "Mrs. Hayes, if the court determines you are indeed Abigail Morgan, what do you intend to do with your inheritance?" It was the question everyone wanted answered, the one that would reveal whether this woman from Montana truly had designs on the Morgan fortune. Abigail met the judge's gaze steadily. "First, I would establish a foundation to assist burn victims, particularly young women whose injuries have left them, like me, facing a world that often values appearance above character. Second, I would secure the future of our ranch and the livelihoods of those who depend on it. And third," she paused, her voice softening, "I would honor the few good memories of my father by ensuring his legal legacy, his support for educational institutions and libraries, continues." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this unexpected answer. Even Harrison's carefully maintained expression slipped, revealing momentary surprise. "You speak of honoring your father," Judge Hamilton observed, "yet you claim he abandoned you after your injuries." "He did," Abigail confirmed, "and that failure will always be part of our story. But before my mother died, before the fire, he was capable of generosity and vision. I choose to honor those qualities, even while acknowledging his profound failings as a father." The judge studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in not just her words but her demeanor, the quiet confidence with which she addressed the court despite her visible scars and the scrutiny of strangers. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. You may step down." The remainder of the hearing proceeded with technical, legal arguments, but to many observers, the matter seemed already decided. Abigail Morgan Hayes had presented not just legal evidence of her identity, but a character and presence that could not be easily dismissed or pathologized. When Judge Hamilton finally gavelled the proceedings to a close, announcing he would deliver his ruling the following morning, there was a sense of inevitability in the air. Harrison Morgan departed without acknowledging Abigail, his rigid posture betraying his awareness that the tide had turned against him. Outside the courthouse, as Nathaniel and Abigail descended the steps, they were surprised to find Silas Reed waiting for them, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Hayes, I believe we haven't been formally introduced, but I've been observing you since your arrival in Chicago." Harrison's investigator, Nathaniel surmised, positioning himself protectively beside Abigail. Reed nodded. Until this afternoon, I've tendered my resignation. He hesitated, then continued. What I witnessed in that courtroom today, your dignity, your integrity, it doesn't align with the narrative I was hired to support. What narrative was that? Abigail asked quietly. That you were either an imposter or mentally unstable. Having watched you these past days, I can attest to neither being true. Reed shifted uncomfortably. I should also warn you that Harrison isn't likely to accept defeat gracefully. He has invested considerable resources in preventing your inheritance, and men like him don't surrender easily. Why are you telling us this? Nathaniel's suspicion was evident. Because sometimes a man needs to choose which side of history he stands on. Reed replaced his hat. Good day to you both, and good luck tomorrow. As he walked away, Nathaniel and Abigail exchanged glances, the investigators' warning adding a new layer of concern to their already complex situation. Do you think Harrison might try something desperate? Abigail asked as they made their way back to their hotel. Men who believe they're entitled to something can be unpredictable when that entitlement is threatened, Nathaniel replied thoughtfully. But we've faced worse challenges together. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in their hotel room, a sense of anticipation hung between them. Whatever the judge's decision, they both knew their time in Chicago was approaching its conclusion. The question that remained unspoken was what they would take back to Montana with them. Just memories and closure, or the responsibilities and opportunities of the Morgan inheritance as well. Whatever happens tomorrow, Nathaniel said, reaching across the small table for her hand, we face it together, and then we go home. Home, Abigail repeated, the word carrying all the warmth and belonging she had found at Horizon Ranch. Yes, whatever else changes, that remains constant. The next morning, they returned to the courthouse to find an unexpectedly large crowd gathered. News of the case had spread, drawing curious onlookers eager to witness the conclusion of what the morning papers had dubbed the return of the lost heiress. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Harrison Morgan sat with his attorneys, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. Wells greeted Nathaniel and Abigail with cautious optimism, indicating he believed the ruling would be favorable. When Judge Hamilton entered and called the court to order, the room fell into expectant silence. Having reviewed the evidence presented in the matter of the estate of Ezekiel Morgan, he began, his tone measured and formal, I find the testimony and documentation compelling. The birthmark, childhood records, and witness identifications establish beyond reasonable doubt that Mrs. Abigail Hayes is indeed the daughter of Ezekiel Morgan, previously believed deceased. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's stern glance. Furthermore, I find no evidence to support claims that Mrs. Hayes is mentally incompetent or acting under undue influence. Her testimony yesterday demonstrated clear reasoning, emotional maturity, and sound judgment. He looked directly at Harrison. The challenge to the will is therefore dismissed. Abigail Morgan Hayes is recognized as the rightful heir to the Morgan estate, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. The judge's gavel came down with finality, officially ending 14 years of imposed absence from her own identity. Abigail closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the moment, not triumph over Harrison, but reclamation of the self that had been denied to her for so long. As the courtroom began to empty, Harrison approached their table, his attorneys trailing nervously behind. Nathaniel tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but Harrison simply stood before Abigail, studying her face with an unreadable expression. You have his eyes, he finally said. Ezekiel's eyes. I should have seen it immediately. Is that an acknowledgement that I am who I claim to be? Abigail asked calmly. Harrison inclined his head slightly. The court has ruled. I accept its decision. But not without resentment, Nathaniel observed. A tight smile crossed Harrison's features. The Morgan fortune has been in my sights for many years, Mr. Hayes. Adjusting expectations takes time. He returned his attention to Abigail. I hope you'll manage it wisely. It represents generations of careful stewardship. I intend to honor that legacy, she replied evenly, though perhaps not in the ways you might expect. Something like grudging respect flickered in Harrison's eyes. You're more a Morgan than Ezekiel probably realized. Stubborn, determined. He offered his hand. Cousin. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail accepted the handshake, recognizing it as the closest thing to a concession she was likely to receive. "Cousin," she acknowledged, "I bear no ill will toward you for challenging my claim. You believed you were protecting the family legacy, and now that legacy is in your hands." With a final assessing look, Harrison departed, leaving them alone with Wells, who was beaming with satisfaction. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes. You are now one of the wealthiest women in Chicago." He began gathering his papers. "We should meet tomorrow to begin the formal transfer process. There will be accounts to review, properties to inspect." "Mr. Wells," Abigail interrupted gently, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but my husband and I will be returning to Montana as soon as possible. The foundation I mentioned can be established through correspondence, and I trust your firm to manage the day-to-day operations of the Chicago properties in my absence." The lawyer blinked in surprise. "But surely you'll want to take up residence in your father's home. It's been maintained in perfect condition, and as the Morgan heir—" "My home is Horizon Ranch," Abigail said firmly. "My life is there with my husband. The Morgan wealth is a responsibility I accept, but it doesn't change who I am or where I belong." Wells glanced between them, clearly struggling to understand how anyone could choose a remote ranch over the privileges of Chicago society. "As you wish, Mrs. Hayes. We'll arrange for regular reports to be sent to you in Montana, and you can return for quarterly meetings as needed." As they left the courthouse, Abigail paused on the steps, looking out over the city that had once been her home, the place where she had lost everything and now, ironically, gained a fortune. Nathaniel stood beside her, his presence a constant anchor in the changing seas of her circumstances. "Ready to go home?" he asked, offering his arm. Abigail smiled, taking his arm and turning away from Chicago's imposing skyline. "More than ready. We have a garden to tend, horses to feed, and a life to continue building together." As they walked away from the courthouse, a chapter closed behind them. Not just Abigail's past with her father, but the uncertainty that had shadowed their relationship since that night on the porch when fear had briefly won. Now, having faced their ghost together and emerged stronger, they could return to Horizon Ranch not just as husband and wife in legal terms, but as partners who had chosen each other completely, with full knowledge of the scars they each carried, both visible and invisible. The Montana winter that had once seemed so bleak had given way to the promise of endless summers together, a love born in the cold but destined to flourish in all seasons.